Hi, Dave Scotland for Tuts Plus, and this is our second episode in our 10-part series, Welcome to After Effects. Today we're going to take a look at a project. We're going to dive in the deep end. I think it's important that if you're starting out in After Effects that you really get your hands dirty early on and don't get bogged down with too much of the detail until it becomes more applicable as you work your way through projects. So what I'm going to do is step you through a process. All you need to do is pace yourself along at the same pace that I'm going, and as I click and open and implement various things, then you should follow along and use the assets that I've provided for this tutorial. So to give you a bit of an indication of where we're heading, this is a render of roughly what we've got in mind. It's very simple. It's actually based on a project that you can also do at Tuts Plus, where we create that background. But all of this motion graphics work and the text animation and pretty much everything you see here, with the exception of the background footage, is created in the session we're about to step through. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to do is start a new project. So if you're not sitting in a new project window, go ahead and just go up to File, New, and New Project. And if you've already been in After Effects, you may be prompted with this warning here: do you wish to save, don't save, or cancel? We don't want to save, we haven't actually done anything, so that's quite okay. Now you'll see here that we have a project tab. Now if your interface doesn't look exactly like mine, then you should probably go up to your window workspace and just reset standard. Just make sure standard is ticked and then reset standard, and that's going to reset it back to the After Effects default standard workspace. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same sort of methodology I tend to use when I use After Effects, which is very right click oriented. When I implement changes in my projects, I tend to use the right click button on the mouse, and I'm going to use that to bring in our footage. So I'm just going to right click anywhere in an open space here in the project tab, and that brings up this little menu, and we need to go into import, and I want to bring in multiple files. Now you may need to browse a little bit to get to your files, and look for a folder called footage in brackets in the project files that you downloaded for this session. Now because we use the import multiple files, it allows me to import a file. I'm going to click on the audio first, and then I'm going to go open, and then it pops me back into this window again, but you'll notice over here on the left that I have audio sitting in my project now. So it's brought that one item in, and now it's popped me back to this browse window and allowing me to select a second object. And I'm going to go OK, and that leaves one more, and if I go OK, this one's a little bit different. It has an alpha channel, which I'm going to explain a little bit more shortly, and it's asking me how to treat that alpha channel. Now I'm just going to go guess for now, just until I explain with a bit more detail, and just go OK. Now it's asking, do I want to import another file here, and I don't. I only had the 3 files, so I'm just going to say done. Okay, now I have my 3 files here, and I just quickly wanted to show you, I'm just going to delete them, and I just quickly wanted to show you another way to bring these in. I'm just going to right click, import multiple files, and as long as they're sitting in a folder, which they are here, they're all sitting in the one folder, I can go up one level, highlight that folder, and click this button down the bottom that says import folder, and it will bring everything in from that folder. I'm just going to say done. You'll notice over here, not only has it brought everything in, if I click the twirly arrow to reveal what's inside, it's brought every object in, but it's also created a folder the same name as the folder that was out in my Windows browser. So this is a very efficient way of bringing in a folder full of files. So when you stay very organized with your files in folders, you can bring them in wholesale in the folder structure and maintain that folder structure to stay organized. So we're going to use this throughout this project. Now let's just have a quick look at this Rue sign TGA. I'm just going to double click on it. When you look at this image, you can see all the way around the edge is black. But if I click on this icon here, which is toggle transparency grid, it's going to show me exactly what is transparent in the image. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll notice that right the way around the edge of the image is this transparent band. Now that is actually built into the file. Now this is going to become a lot more apparent as we move throughout the series, because alpha channels are very important. But for now, I'm just going to quickly glance over what an alpha channel is. Every image has 3 default channels, and if I look here, you can see show channel and color management set. I'm just going to click on that to bring this up. Every image has a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. Now, not every image has an alpha channel. Some images don't, in fact, have an alpha channel, and a JPEG is a great example of an image that does not have an alpha channel. So what we use a lot in After Effects is images that actually carry an alpha channel. Now, an alpha channel is quite simply transparency information in the image. So every pixel in an image has a red value, it has a green value, it has a blue value, and it has an alpha value if the image is the type of image that can hold an alpha channel. I'm going to explain that in a lot more detail as we move throughout this series, but just for now, the thing to look for is in your project window, notice up here that there is a little plus sign next to millions of colors. Millions of colors plus dictates that this image has an alpha channel. It has an extra 8 bits of information on top of the 8 bits of green, the 8 bits of red, and the 8 bits of blue for every pixel in the image. So keep an eye out for that and use those as we move forward, because it's much easier to use assets that have an alpha channel than to go in and mask out all of these details to give you the transparency you need. So let's just close this down, this footage preview window here, and let's get started. The first thing I want to do is create a new composition. Now you can go up into the composition pull down menu and click new composition, but I like to use this button down here, this create new composition button, and later on you'll start to use this quite a lot because there's a few different ways to create a composition that we're going to cover. I'm just going to click on that button. It's going to open up this composition settings window. And it's very important to understand this window and get it right, because if you put some of the wrong settings into this window, you can basically back yourself into a corner that you can't get out of later on. And one of the key areas that I'm talking about in that instance is the frame rate, the amount of frames per second. If you set the wrong frame rate and then later on want to change that to a different frame rate, if you've done animation in that composition, you can really run into some problems. So be very careful about setting the frame rate and understand what the final frame rate needs to be. We're going to be working at 25 frames per second in this project. We're also going to set a custom preset for the size of our composition. We're going to go 720 pixels wide, and we're also going to go 404 pixels high. Worth mentioning is all of the presets in this menu here. You can see a lot of film, 2K, 4K, Cineon presets down the bottom. We've got a lot of HD presets, and up the top we've got a few old school TV type presets with PAL, NTSC, D1, DV, and we've even got some web presets right at the very top. But as you start to develop your knowledge with After Effects, you'll start to understand what all of these presets mean, and you'll probably put them in yourself rather than rely on these presets. The next thing is square pixels. It's very important to use square pixels unless you otherwise need non-square pixels. So always use square pixels unless someone has given you a specific specification to use a non-square pixel. This is very important because non-square pixels are anamorphic in nature, and there is a very unique way that you need to treat anamorphic pixels when you're working in a compositing or a motion graphics project. And we're also going to make sure that the start frame is 0. Now, because this is set to absolute frames at the moment, and it's 25 frames per second, we want 10 seconds, which quite simply is 250 frames. I want to set the background color so that I can recognize it if it's showing through in my composition. Now, this is very important. Some people just leave this as black, and quite often black can fool you into thinking that there is a black solid background, when in many instances it's actually transparent, because the background in After Effects is not actually renderable. If you want a black background, you have to put a black solid frame underneath all of your artwork. Now that's going to become a lot more apparent later on. So I'm just going to go for a sort of a reddy grey middle gray, just go OK. And last thing I'll do is give it a name. Now I'm going to call this my master comp. And I'm going to go OK. So you'll see that our interface has changed a little bit. I now have this checkerboard here. That's because I've left the toggle transparency grid, but if I tick that, it now turns to my background color that I set. And down the bottom, we have my timeline, and it is represented with a timeline on the right and all of my settings for my comp. Throughout this series, you'll hear me say the word comp instead of composition. That's just lingo that goes with After Effects, and we refer to compositions as comps. Don't be too confused whenever I use the phrase comp. Now, on the left-hand side of this timeline are all of my features, and there's a couple of different ways that I can see the various features within the comp. Notice down the bottom, in the bottom left corner, I've got three little tiny icons. One is expand or collapse the layer switches. If I click on that, you'll notice it gives me a bunch more choices here, and it's a toggle. And so too is the next one, collapse transfer controls pane. And if I click that, I'm getting a lot more and a lot less features in my composition. And if I click the third one, I get all of these time parameter features as well. And if I click all three, basically everything is switched on, but look how much real estate, screen real estate I have for my actual composition. And this is not the way we tend to work. We try to minimize these controls to reflect just the work that we're doing at the time, and we try to give ourselves as much timeline visible in the viewport as we can. And you'll just sort of you'll learn that as we go along, and it's very important to be able to see what we're doing here. What I'm going to do to get us started is to grab my Outback footage MP4. I'm going to click and drag it down into my comp. Now I'm dragging it to a space here, and what that means is it's going to butt up against the first frame down here. Now if I delete that for a second, I could have also grabbed that, pulled it down and put it anywhere along the timeline, say here. It's very important to know that there's nothing is going to play until it hits that point. So it's very important to put it in the right position on the timeline. Now get used to the idea of using the shift button. When you hold shift, any movement of video in the timeline will actually snap to various objects within the timeline. If I put this marker here and hold shift and drag this piece of footage, it will snap to that marker. Likewise, if I hold shift, it will snap to the very first frame rather than going straight past like this and perhaps starting too late in our project. So you'll see that we have a 10-second piece of footage because it perfectly fits the start and the end of my 250 frame composition. So let's keep moving forward. What I'm going to do is around about frame 100, I want that kangaroo sign to start to zoom up or scale up from the center and reach an end desired size and stop in the image. So in order to do that, we need to bring our roo sign down and put it on top. Now if I put it underneath, it will disappear because it is no longer visible underneath the Outback footage. I need to put it on top for it to be visible. Now it's way too big. You can see it's showing the outer edge of the image is much bigger than the actual composition. Now once again, we're going to use that shift button. We're going to grab a corner. I'm going to grab it first, clicking and holding, and then I'm going to hit shift. And what will happen is it'll only allow me to scale this image in its original proportions. It's not going to, if I hold shift, it's not going to let me squash it or stretch it. It will only let me scale it in its perfect square shape. So I'm going to put it about, let's put it about there. And what this is representing is the end size that I wanted. I'm going to animate this going from a much smaller size, but we want to know how big we want this image to be at the end of our animation. The next thing I need to do is rotate this sign around to its preferred orientation. Now, in our composition window here, you'll see these little arrows. Now, I'm going to refer to these as twirly arrows because as you click them, they will twirl down and reveal more information underneath. Here's another twirly arrow. I'm going to click that, and underneath it are all of the transforms that are available. I'm just going to move this up for a second. all of the transforms that are available for this layer. You can see I've got an anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. I'm going to explain these in more detail in a future episode, but these twirly arrows are very, very important to explore these and understand how these work. I need to rotate my image, and here's my rotation setting down here. So I'm just going to click, hold, and drag left and right to rotate the image around. Or I could literally click on the number, it highlights, there's a box around it, which means it's ready for me to type something in. I'm going to type minus 45, meaning minus 45 degrees, and you can see it's perfectly lined up in my image now. So it's oriented correctly. Now I need to animate the scale. Well, notice the little stopwatch icons that are down next to these transform parameters. Anytime you see a stopwatch in After Effects, that means it's an animatable property. Okay, so let's go ahead and lay in some animation. The first thing we need to do is to click on the stopwatch icon for scale. And you'll see that it is now highlighted, or it has a square around the stopwatch icon. Now that basically means that that animation is active for this parameter. It also places a keyframe, which is indicated by this diamond shaped object on the timeline. And basically a keyframe saves the state of this parameter, scale in this instance, at that frame. So I'm sitting at frame 101, and I've clicked on the stopwatch. It automatically creates a keyframe for 16.2% scale. And that's exactly what we want. Now what I'm going to do is move the timeline indicator just by clicking and dragging it back to frame 0. And then I'm going to type in to this value here, 0. And you'll see that both of these values change to 0. And that's because of the little link icon here, which constrains both values to match. So whatever I type into one is copied into the other automatically. If you want to independently scale something, you need to untick this. So you'll see that if we just scrub on the timeline, we have that sign now growing all the way between 0 and 100. Now, what I want to do is retime some of this animation. So, as I covered in the last episode, we can play back our animation by clicking on this button, the RAM preview, or you can use the 0 key on the number pad on your keyboard as the shortcut. But we'll RAM preview what we have, and what will happen is this green bar will fill, and then when it's filled, it will play back in real time. And you can see that it's very subtle, it's very slow, and we want something that feels a little bit more dynamic. So let's retime it a little bit. What I'm going to do is move my time indicator to about 1:15. Now, if your time indicator looks different to this, you can hold Control and click on this yellow number, and it will change to hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. I like to use absolute frame mode by holding Control and clicking it again, and that way I have the absolute frame mode. But in the more recent versions of After Effects, you can see both here indicated in your composition. So now that we're at 1:15, I'm going to grab this keyframe, click and drag it to my indicator, and I'm holding Shift to get it to snap exactly in that place. And then I'm going to put the indicator back to 100. I'm going to grab the first keyframe and snap it to 100. Now let's quickly watch that back and see the difference. And so it's much more dynamic. It shows the background, it shows the kangaroos jumping across here, and then at frame 100, which for us is 4 seconds into our piece, it zooms up and it stops here. Now what I'm going to do is show you a little trick that you can do to give it a little bit more dynamic. I'm going to take this keyframe, I'm going to go over 2 frames using the next frame button here. I'm going to go 1, 2, and with the keyframe highlighted, I'm going to go Control C to copy, Control V to paste. Now, Control C copied the last keyframe, the one that was highlighted, and Control V will paste that copy straight down where the time indicator is. So we've got 2 keyframes that are identical. Now I'm just going to go back to the previous one, and I'm going to raise this value. Now, another way to raise the value of a parameter is to highlight it and use your up and down arrows on your keyboard. So I'm just going to raise it up slightly, and you'll see what will happen if I drag on the timeline. It's going to go a little bit beyond where we want it to be, and then it's going to come back and rest. And now if we play that, you'll see that we get this slightly more dynamic animation where it overshoots the scale and then comes back and rests a couple of frames later. So that's going to work nicely. Everything's working quite okay so far. So let's move on. The next thing I want to do is place a little bit of animation on some blur effects on our background image. Now, to do that, we need to apply an effect. So what I'm going to do is highlight my background image, and in the standard workspace, unfortunately, there is no effects controls panel. So we need to activate our effects controls just by coming into Window, come down to effects controls and click on them. And where they'll pop up is right here next to the project tab. So they'll share the same location in our interface, and we can jog between each one. Now, when you have effects controls, they're empty at the moment because I haven't added any effects. But if I highlight the MP4, the Outback footage, there's a number of ways I can add an effect. I'm going to show you the way I use the most. I'm just going to right click on a space in my effects controls panel, which brings up my effects here. Now, your effects may look a little different to mine because I have some plugins that I've installed, and later on in the series I'll give you a look at some of these common plugins. But what I'm looking for here is the blur and sharpen effects, and I'm going to come down to the fast blur. Now, fast blur is a great way to get blur happening quite fast without too many render overheads or slowing down your system too much. Now, notice if I wind up the blurriness, the background image goes quite blurry, but also notice if I zoom over on the edge here, notice the background, my composition background, that pinky red color is actually coming through on the edges, and that's undesirable. We don't really want that. That's why we tick this little button here called Repeat Edge Pixels. If I click on that, that disappears and the blur happens all the way off the edge of the image. So 9 times out of 10 you're going to want to tick Repeat Edge Pixels whenever you use fast blur, and you will use fast blur a lot. Now, the timing, I'm going to put this back to 0, and the timing, I'm going to get this to blur pretty much while this is zooming up. So the way I can do that, if I highlight the Ru sign layer and use the U shortcut, that will show me any animation that's been placed on that layer. And you'll see that straight away it only shows me the scale parameter, which is the only one that has been animated. By seeing these keyframes, I can use them to reference when to put the timing on for my fast blur on my background footage. So at this frame here, which is frame 100, I'm going to click the stopwatch for blurriness here, and I could always use the twirly arrows to access effects, fast blur, blurriness, and click the stopwatch here, but it's much quicker to use the effects controls up here. And just going to hit U to bring up that keyframe, and you'll see that it pops up straight away without anything else visible. Now what I'm going to do is come through to my next keyframe, and I'm going to wind up the blur until I'm happy with the level of blur that's there. Now I want to still see what's going on in the background, but I want it to be fairly blurry as well. And if we just RAM preview that, you'll see that we should get a nice animation of the sign zooming up and the background turning blurry, and that puts focus on the sign, and that's exactly what we want. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight these keyframes here just using the marquee selection tool. You click, hold and drag to drag this box around the keyframes. It allows you to select multiple keyframes, and then what I want to do is use the F9 shortcut, or I could right click, go keyframe assistant, easy ease. Now what that does is makes the animation slowly reach its final state of blurriness of 11, and later on in the series I'll be stepping through some animation and going in through these keyframe properties in a lot more detail, but that's just going to make for a lot nicer animation. And I'm going to also do that for the first keyframe of our Ru sign scaling. So just highlight that first one. This time I'll use the F9 shortcut And you'll see there now it's also an easy ease. It looks like a little bit like an hourglass icon, the keyframes. So we've got some nice animation happening on the background blur, and we've got our image here. Next thing we want to do is create a little bit of text for our business name. And the first word that we want is Outback, and we want it to go across our image, and we're just going to fade it up. But the first thing we need to do is create it. So what we want to do is click on the type tool at the top, and we want to click somewhere in our viewport. You'll notice that my cursor has turned into a slightly different cursor, which is the type cursor. I'm just going to click roughly in the middle, and I'm just going to type the word Outback. And at the moment the font is wrong, so what I'm going to do is double click on the layer. Now by doing that, it highlights the whole text, and that allows me to use my characters in my character tab here. And if you can't see this, it might be hidden behind your effects presets. Just click on here, and you can change the size of the font. You can change the spacing between the letters of the font, and pretty much anything you can do to a font in Photoshop you can do here, with a couple of extra features in After Effects as well. So I'm going to find the font that I need. So the font that I've actually gone for in my design is called Rage Italic. Now if you don't have this, you could easily download it and install it into your Windows system or your Mac system. So it's down the list, Rage Italic, there it is there. And what I'm going to do is just play with some of the settings here. Just going to raise it up, maybe bring the text in a little bit, and might go for a little bit of lowercase, and have the O stand out a little bit. Something like that looks pretty good. And I'll just raise up the size. That's working pretty well. Let me bring it down slightly. Now, in order to change the color, I want to have an orange color in it. I'm going to double click just to make sure that it's selected, and I can click here in the character tab to change the fill color. I'm going to go for an orange somewhere like this. That looks pretty good. And you'll notice that there's a black outline around the text. That's because the character actually has a fill color, and it also has a stroke color around the edge. Now if I click on the stroke color, now it's come to the front and allows me to work on the settings for the stroke color. This little white box with a red slash through it allows me to get rid of the stroke altogether. You'll see that now there is no longer a stroke, but it's much harder to see in the image. So what I'm going to do is click on the black for the stroke, but I need to make sure I've double clicked on the text for that to happen. So there we go, and I can make the stroke as thin or as thick as I want. You can see there that I'm able to manipulate the size of the stroke. I'm just going to have a 1 pixel stroke. You've also got some other settings here for stroke, so definitely explore all of the settings that are available in the text or character window here. And you'll notice down the bottom here is a panel called Paragraph. I like to actually break that off and place it up next to my character, just so that they can travel side by side. I might even just pull my character to the left here. That way I can amend the characters in a word or a phrase, and then I can jump into my paragraph and tell it to be either left aligned, right aligned, or centered. In this instance, we're going to stay with centered. So let's just deselect by clicking on a blank spot down here in our composition area, and that's looking pretty good. I might double click it and just bring the size slightly larger. Maybe bring this a little closer. That's looking pretty good. I'm happy with that. So the next thing I want to do is animate this to fade on. And I want it to fade on just as the sign has reached its full size. So once again, I'm going to highlight the sign layer. I'm going to hit U just to bring up those keyframes. And I'm going to go to this frame here where the sign reaches its oversize. And then I'm going to highlight the Outback text layer. Using the twirly arrows, I can bring up the transform opacity. So we'll give ourselves a little bit of real estate here. You can see here that we have opacity, rotation, scale, position, and down the bottom we can just click on the stopwatch, and that just creates a keyframe. Now it creates a keyframe at 100%. If we widen that down to 0, then it will be an invisible element. What we want to do is leave it at 0, and then I'm going to come through, probably notice the time here is 1:15. Let's bring that out to say 1:35, and then wind up the value to 100. So you'll see that it starts out at 0, and then it starts to fade up to 100%. So what we've done there is we've animated the visibility of the text. Now we're also going to put a little bit of easy ease on those keyframes. So go ahead and draw a marquee around the keyframes and use your F9 shortcut, or right click on the keyframe, keyframe assistant, and easy ease. And that'll give us some nice smooth animation on the opacity. So we're looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and have a little bit of a RAM preview and see how it's coming together. So we've got a bit of introductory footage, and then we see our sign come up, our background goes blurry, and then our logo comes in and fades up. So we're working pretty well there. So the next thing we want to do is implement some text to scroll on or animate onto the screen for the word adventures. So let's go ahead and create a new text object. We'll come slightly further in so we can see where to line it up. In fact, I'm just going to take that out back and slightly move it down, and I'm using Shift to make sure that it stays in line. If you hold Shift while you move an asset in After Effects, it will actually stay in the vertical or horizontal direction without floating off that axis as you move it. So give that a try. What I want is a new text object, so I'm clicking on the Type tool again, and I'm going to click below my Outback here. Now be careful, what I actually did there was I clicked, but because I was too close to this Outback footage, it has just selected the original Outback footage and placed a cursor in between the T and the B. So it's not actually a new piece of footage. If you do this part correctly, what will actually happen is there will be a new layer appear here. So make sure you give yourself enough room. You can always reposition it once you type in your text. And you can see here I have a new layer now. So start typing. This is going to be adventures. And it's going to be a different type, a different font. So I'm going to double click on it to highlight the text. I'll pull the size down just so we can see what we're doing. And this one's going to be just an old school Bookman, just an old style Bookman font. And this one needs to be black. So I'm just clicking on the fill color here and making it black. And I'm going to make the outline or the stroke color see-through. So it's just the outline that I want in the image because it's black. If you put black on black, all you're doing is making the text fatter, and it can run into some problems in the corners of certain letters. So the other thing I want to do is just position this up a little higher, and what I can do is just highlight the layer, go back to my selection tool and click on anywhere on the actual object itself and just move it up into position, and then play with the font a little bit and maybe bring it out a little wider. Something like that feels pretty good. Just might go a little bit smaller on the font. That looks not too bad. I can also highlight the layer and use my up and down arrow keys just to nudge it into position. This is while I have the selection tool or the text tool active. So that looks pretty good. So now what we want to do is animate the characters to come on. Now what we're going to do is use some of the available presets, and we're going to cover this in a little bit more detail when we get to text as a special chapter in this 10-part series. But for now, let's just go to our effects and presets menu, and if I go to my animation presets and hit the twirly arrow, I'm able to go down to the text section and twirly arrow once again, and we have animate in, and the one I'm looking for is random shuffle in. There it is. All we do is grab that and drag it onto the layer, and it'll disappear off the screen, And if I hit U on that layer, you'll see that there are now some keyframes. And exactly where the time slider was is where the animation will start. And you'll see that the letters start coming on in a random pattern to ultimately take up the position they were when we first created the word. So we can retime this using those 2 keyframes there. And what we want to do is just go back to our Outback word, hit U to see the 2 keyframes for opacity that we created. And what we want to do is start these coming in once that word has materialized. And we want it to come in a little quicker than what the preset has given us. It starts at 135. Let's go say 155. And I can always click on this number and type in 155 to be specific, and then just grab this, hold down the shift, and it will snap to the time slider. So let's go ahead and have a look at our RAM preview and see how that's coming together. So it's looking pretty good. I think I want the speed of the Roo sign to be a bit quicker, so I'm just going to hit U to bring up its animation for scale, and I'm just going to move this first keyframe a little bit closer to these last 2 keyframes, and you'll see that this should give us a much snappier animation on the sign scale. There we go. That's working pretty well, and that way I think we can probably be a little slower on the animation for our bottom text. I think that's going to work okay. So we can use the twirly arrows to twirl these up and give ourselves a little bit more real estate down in this window here. Notice here I have a column that says parent, and we're going to get to the parent column later on in more detail, but for now it's just taking up valuable space. So on any column that I want to hide, I can right click at the top where the name of the column is, and I can say hide this, or I can bring up my columns menu and untick any columns I don't require. So I'm just going to untick the parent column, and you can see I get a lot more real estate on my timeline to play with here now. I can always zoom in and zoom out on my timeline using this slider here, indicated by the large and small little mountains icon. And I can also grab this top bar and bring it in from the left. I can bring it in from the right, or down here it brings it in from the left and right and zooms in on the time slider. So please explore those as you work in these projects. So we're looking pretty good. We're almost done. The next thing I want to do is bring a common effect that we tend to use in compositing and sometimes in motion graphics, which is a vignette. I want to bring focus to the center of the screen, and I want to take away the focus from the edges of the screen. And a vignette's very handy for that. So just come up to the layer pull down menu and just select New, Solid. And what you get presented with is this dialog box. This is a new solid box, and what we can do is give it a name. This one's going to be called Vignette, and I want the color to be black. You can select whatever color you want, but for a vignette it's usually black, and I want to make it comp size. Then just go OK, and what you're left with is a black solid card, is the best way to describe it, that is over the top of everything in my scene. Now if I move it underneath my text, then you'll see the Outback is over the top of it. In fact, Adventures is actually over the top of it too, but it's black and we can't see it. If I go underneath the Roo sign, you'll see that it's on top of my background but underneath the Roo sign. Now the way we want to get this vignette to work is, let's highlight it. And then if we come up to this section here where it says rectangle tool, this is the vector section here, which I'm going to cover in a lot more detail in a future episode. But for now, if you click and hold your mouse on this rectangle tool, you'll see all of the other standard mask shapes that are available to us. And what I want to do is use the ellipse tool. So if I'm still clicking and holding, I haven't let go of the mouse yet, and I'm coming down to the ellipse tool. Then I'm just going to let it go, and you can see that that icon is now an ellipse instead of a square. Now if I double click on it, it creates a ellipse mask, the perfect shape for the solid that we had highlighted when we created the mask. Now what I want to do, if I bring up a little bit more real estate, if you click the twirly arrows, you'll notice that the vignette now has a mask here, and there's a mask 1, and it's yellow in shape and in color, and you can see that the shape is here. Now what I can actually do is click the twirly arrows and reveal the other settings for that mask, including feather. And if I wind up the feather, you can see that we get this nice soft edge here. If I wind the feather down, we get a very sharp edge. Now what we want to do is we want to judge this feather without having to look at this yellow line. To do that, we just click on this little button here. It's toggle mask and shape path visibility. If we click on this, the mask is still there. We're just not staring at the path. Once you've created the path, often what you need to do is just tweak the feather, the expansion, and by seeing the mask, it becomes a distraction and you can't actually judge exactly what you're doing. So that's why this toggle button is actually here. So what I'm going to do is really ramp this mask. Then I'm going to change this drop down arrow here, and I'm going to explain this in more detail in future episode. I'm going to change this to subtract. And instead of the inside being black, the outside of the mask is now black and the inside is invisible. So if I was to wind this down to 0 as the feather, you'd see that that's exactly what's going on here. If I go back to add, then it's flipped around. So by going subtract and then winding the feather up, we get this nice dark edge around here. But it's way too heavy at the moment. What we want to do, in fact, I'll come back to an earlier frame here, right back to frame 0. What we want to do is change the type of layer overlay that this vignette layer is. And at the moment it's set to normal. To bring up the controls we need to click on this button right down the bottom that says toggle switches. So go ahead and click that, which reveals these layer modes here. And if this is a toggle, and we can flip back and forward by clicking that button. So instead of having these radio switches here, we can go to our layer modes. Now look at, by default, everything is a normal layer mode in our composition so far, but we have a lot more available. In fact, if you've done any Photoshop work, you would recognize a lot of these layer modes. In fact, there's a lot more available in After Effects than there are in Photoshop. So we're going to get to those in a lot more detail in a future episode, but for now I want to change that vignette layer mode to classic color burn, and then I want to just bring up the opacity of that vignette layer, and I want to wind it down until we get to around about 10 or 12 should do us, and then I'm going to highlight it and just come up slightly until we start to see the vignette happening. Looks like about 25 is okay. Now you might say that I can't really see anything happening there. A good vignette, you only recognize that it's there when you switch it on and off. Now we can do that in After Effects, and we tend to do this a lot to work out exactly how our composition is coming together. Notice this row of eyeball icons down the left hand side. They're the visibility icons that allow us to switch a layer on and off. I can come through here, maybe take the ruse sign and I can switch it on and off. I can take the adventures and switch it on and off, but I can also take the vignette and switch that on and off as well. And you can see that before, when it looked like it wasn't really there, it wasn't doing anything, now that I switch it on and off, you can definitely see that there's a slightly darker edge around our image, and that forces the eye into the image to concentrate what's on in the center. And that's what a vignette is designed to do. So by using a classic color burn, we take the underlying colors, rather than just adding black, we're adding darker values of the values that are already in the image. So that'll become a lot more apparent when we take a closer look at how color works in After Effects as well. Our piece is coming along quite well. We're almost there. All we need to do now is do a final fade out to white at the end, just to reveal the logo and to get rid of the background image. And we need to put our audio into the piece. So let's get the audio out of the road first. We'll come up into our project window up here and grab our audio and just drag it down underneath our image. And you'll see that there's a little speaker icon here, and that just means that that audio is active in the timeline, and you can RAM preview to see how that's working. So to bring up the white panel at the end underneath our logo, we need a white solid similar to the black solid we created. So we're just going to go back up to our layer pull down menu, just go new solid, and we're going to change the color this time to white, and we're going to leave it, make it comp size, and we'll just call this white BG and go OK. Now unfortunately it's over the top of everything. What I can do is just click on the eyeball and move it down underneath the Roo sign, but above the vignette and the outback footage and the audio is fine. So I'm going to switch it back on. You can see that's the final design that we want to end up with. So we want to animate this white background up right at the very end to get rid of or to come over the top of our background footage. So let's go ahead and work some timing here. If we bring up the opacity for the white solid, a shortcut key to bring up the opacity is to just hit T to bring up the opacity, and we click on the stopwatch, and that creates a keyframe at the end of 100% opacity. Now if we come back, we're at 249 at the end. Let's come back to, say, let's come back to around about 210. Looks about right. 211 is fine. And then wind the opacity down to 0. Then we're just going to grab that keyframe, just highlight that first keyframe, and then we're going to keyframe assistant easy ease. And that way it's going to smoothly start to animate up until we ultimately get left with white. And we want the white to probably happen a little earlier so that we have a few frames at the end where it is absolutely white, which means we might want to bring our keyframe a little sooner. So let's go to frame 200. Let's move our first keyframe to 200, and let's leave our second keyframe at about 235. So that's looking pretty good. Let's give it one last, or second to last, RAM preview. So we've got our footage, there's our sign, our outback, we've got our ventures coming in, and now we have our logo isolated on the white background. That's looking fantastic. The last thing I want to do is implement some motion blur, because the human eye does not like to see movement without motion blur. Something is, we just register that something is wrong. Quite often we don't know what exactly is wrong, but our mind won't take the message in because we're not seeing something we expect to see. Now that's very common in motion graphics. Here what I want to do is I want to highlight the sign. I'm going to toggle my switches again to bring back all of these little switches here, and I want to notice there's a column, and if I leave my mouse over it you can see that it's motion blur. What I want to do is tick that column, but I also want to tick the motion blur icon for the comp itself. And if I switch that on, let's come to where this sign is sort of halfway animating on it, and you can see how blurry the edge of the sign is. Now if I untick this motion blur for the comp, you'll see that the motion blur disappears, but I still have the sign motion blur icon on. So it's not enough to just toggle tick the switches, you have to tick motion blur on for the whole comp. Now this is very handy if you have multiple motion blurs on and you want to just uniformly switch them off to make life a bit quicker in After Effects. So just remember, and we're going to do this for all of our objects, our Roo sign and both of our text, and then toggle it on, and that way as the text starts to slide on you'll see this nice motion blur. Notice the difference. As this animates on, without the motion blur it's completely sharp, but with the motion blur it's nice and blurry, and that's exactly how it should be because our brain is expecting to see that level of motion blur. Now if you want to do a full screen or a large RAM preview, you can highlight the viewer here, which is currently set to our composition, and you can hit the tilde key, which is the key on your keyboard next to the 1 key. And if you hit the tilde, it will go to full screen here, or take up the full resolution of your interface, and then use the 0 key on your number pad to RAM preview and get it playing. So here we are. there's our final piece, a very simple motion graphics piece. What we really wanted to do was to dive in the deep end, start pushing and pulling things around, start getting assets down onto a timeline, creating a composition, seeing how the layers work, how the toggle switches work, and anything that we overlooked or brushed past, rest assured we're going to cover them in much more detail throughout the rest of the series. So that's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.